Welcome everybody to Write Better Together. I'm John Myers. Whoops, Write Better Together, afterthought, afterthought of an afterthought. Hey, look everybody, it's Emily Brooks.
Hello, John Myers. What are we talking about?
So in a previous afterthought, I we shared the video which y'all can go search for with Rachel, the ever-changing name Rachel the neurologist. And I made a comment about what story is, and it confused some people, so I would like to clarify that.
Awesome. That's an important topic for us as writers. We need to know what story is.
So story is, some people would say hero, but then people think of the hero's journey, so I don't want to say hero. So the
Mm,
story is a main character with a goal facing an obstacle between the main character and the goal. That's It's that simple and it's that hard. um, and so in that afterthought, we also talked about a log line. A log line needs all three of those things. Plus, I think it needs a ticking time clock. William Martell agrees with me. However, I muddied up the waters by pointing
mm.
out, we had a guest, and I pointed out to Emily and the guest that we all teach literature, and that's not what we teach them. We teach them that story has 6 to 10 elements. I contend six, and then those other four fit into one of the other existing six. So we teach them setting and point of view and theme and style, character. What else? There's one more. It's not a
Plot.
quiz. And plot. Plot slash, because some people would say seven is conflict. I would argue conflict goes into plot, right? And
Sure.
so that's how I boil it down to six. Um, so why do these literature teachers teach these students 6 elements or 10 elements when there's really only three to story? Would you like to say
Hmm.
something to that? And then I will
Well,
clarify what I meant.
so I don't know where you're going with it, but my initial thought is that in those classes, we're trying to give them a vocabulary. And so we're trying to give them the terms that they need to discuss story. So maybe it's more like the six vocabulary that you need to know for plot or for story. I don't
Uh,
know.
exactly.
Sure.
We I don't want to speak for you, but when I teach it, I teach them the 6 elements of story. Um, I explain why those other four. I'll talk about, like, metaphor. Some people say that's an element of story. Well, it's not
Huh.
in metaphor isn't in every story, and it falls
Right.
into style. So that's not one of the elements, right? So I
Yeah, it's
explain
like
where
a
those
good
other
vocabulary word, but it's not
correct.
definitive. Yeah.
So I explain where those other four go, but I say here's the six, and there's not. There's only the three: uh, hero, obstacle, or hero, goal, and obstacles. Um, and so here's so you're 100% correct. We have to teach them that for the vocabulary. But here's how I can explain it if that's confusing listeners at home or driving in their car. Um, here's how I can explain it. The six, they are elements of a story, but
Yeah.
they're not necessary required elements. When I give the example of, I walked out to the mailbox and got some mail and came back in, that's not a story. That's a happening, and a story isn't just a bunch of stuff happening, right? It's not even an amusing anecdote. It's just an occurrence. People say a story has a beginning, middle, and an end, and so does a meal, so does my cheeseburger, right? That's not a story. I ate a cheeseburger isn't a story. However, there's a setting. I When I
Right.
walked out to the mailbox, there's a setting, but it's still not a story.
There's a
There is point of
POV.
view.
Yeah.
It's still not a story. So those
Mhm.
elements that are found in stories are not necessary components of a story. I hope that
Okay.
clarified it.
This already makes more sense to me than the last time because I was like, well, but stories do have those things. Like stories do have point of view and setting, but you're just saying that if you were to like take those with and take like without the necessary elements of story, there would be no story.
Those are correct, yes. And also, they're elements of they're just elements. So pretend it's a car, right? For me to get to Target, I need an engine, four wheels, I guess a steering wheel, and probably brakes. um, and but I don't need air conditioning. I don't need a radio. So air
Sure.
conditioning isn't. It's not an element of a vehicle. But it's air conditioning is air conditioning, right? When I walk out to the mailbox is the mailbox. The front yard is a setting, but it's not an element of the story because there is no story. And so I don't need a radio and air conditioning. I like them to get to Target, but it's not a necessary component of story or of the
The thing
car.
that's difficult for me is to imagine a story. Like, I know you're saying that they're not necessary, but I'm also thinking, like, what would a story be without a setting or a POV?
Well, I'm not saying that they don't have one. I'm saying those the additional air conditioning and radios, just like you can have. I don't know if you can have different air conditioning in a car, but you can have different kinds of radios in a car, right? So you can take. We've talked about it with Cinderella. You can put Cinderella in 600 different settings, right?
Yes.
So it's not
Right.
a necessary component of the story, and
Mm.
because it's just where that story's happening.
Mm. Interesting. So what that's making me think of, so I think different things spark story ideas for people. And if the thing that's sparking a story idea for you is a point of view or a setting or one of those other six elements, you need to be taking that back to those original three things and going, okay, so that sparked the story, but then what is the actual story? I really need a main character. I need an obstacle, etc.
A main character, a goal, and an obstacle. Um, it's funny that you mentioned what you just said about sparking the origin of a story. So I just read this thing. I had it pulled up for a regular episode, but I didn't think it would make a whole regular episode, so I just forgot about it. And but this guy was arguing that all stories start with a setting and then the characters evolve out of the setting. And yeah, and I bet your stories are garbage too because that's not what story is. Uh Characters
Interesting.
appearing organically out of a setting. That's not how you start a story.
I think you could maybe brainstorm a story that way, but when you're actually writing the story, that's not like this. The setting has to be influenced by what matters to your character. You're not just going to describe everything about your setting and then put your character in there. Like your character influences every, like when you're world building. So I write fantasy. When I'm world building, you don't just play around with every single element in the world that you could possibly play with. You only play with the things that matter to the character themselves and to their goal and their obstacles.
Exactly. And 100% exactly. And then the setting, if the setting doesn't matter to the story, so like the movie Nashville, setting is a
Right.
character, and so it does matter. Lake Wobegon
Mhm.
setting is a character. However, Springfield on The Simpsons, it can be in any state. It is in any state. It's in every state, right? And it doesn't matter. However, it might matter if that episode is in Moe's or in uh, Homer and Marge's
Right.
bedroom or whatever, wherever that episode takes place. That might matter, but that's influenced by story. It's not
Yeah.
setting first and then story.
Yeah.
One
And
more
people,
thing.
the
What? Go ahead.
characters are going to be influenced by the setting as well, for sure.
There. What now?
Well, so like when you said The Simpsons, I was like thinking about King of the Hill,
Okay.
um, which is very Texas oriented. That the characters' interaction with like their community is a huge part of the comedy of that show.
True. It's always sunny in Philadelphia. Can
Mm-hmm.
that happen in Detroit?
Right.
Can Atlanta happen in Detroit?
Right.
Um, One more thing while I'm cleaning up things I said in the past. In the brain episode, and this ties into this, Rachel, the neurologist, she's like, brains explain things in stories. And it's this artifice that humans come up with to explain, and that's not. And so she gives the example of seeing someone walking a dog, and our brain creates the story. Oh, they must be walking their dog because here's a dog on a rope or a dog on a leash. So, well, I should have said in that afterthought, that's not a story.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's me walking out to the mailbox. Something happening is not a story. So your whole premise, Rachel, the neurologist, of our brain has to think in stories because it's more efficient. The example you give isn't even a story.
It's difficult that story is used in so many different ways. There's so many different vocabulary or different ways that it's used as a vocabulary word for sure. Actually, since we're talking about that, I have one more thing, and that's that if we're going to correct something I said a story needs change to happen. And then I think we talked about it separately. Um, but I'm curious your thoughts on that. Does a story require change? Because you named all these examples of stories where change doesn't actually
So,
occur.
sometimes change, whether or not change occurs, is debatable.
Right.
But sometimes, and the conversation you're talking about with Larry David on Curb, he had no idea that it was going to last 24 years, but he intentionally set out these people are never going to change.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so in the final episode, they would be the same as they were in the first episode.
And that's
And
very common for sitcoms. Yeah.
and that's and that's true. Um the how, so I'm trying to think. When you say
Well,
it's common
so
in sitcoms, is it?
well, I think it's common in
Convince me.
sitcoms for the characters not to change because you want them to be like they'll change a little bit, but then like the next season they'll be dealing with the same problems. Um, but I do think that sometimes there's an external element of change. Like I've been watching Seinfeld for the first time, and there's the episode where the chicken store opens next door. That's a change that occurs that triggers the rest of the story.
So, oh man, I just thought of
Did I open a can of worms?
no. So that's one of the ones. It's debatable. Did they change? Because the final episode is that
Well, that was
is
the first thing I thought of
is
was
they is that
Seinfeld.
they
Yeah,
didn't. But so I'm trying to think. No, I'm trying to put this in context of a show that everyone's seen. So everyone's seen The Office, right?
sure.
Um, can you say that Dwight and Angela didn't change over the however I don't know how many years it was, 10 years? Yeah, they did,
Yeah,
but they're still Dwight and Angela.
yeah. I think it's that they can't change in fundamental ways. Like you still want them to be the character that you enjoy watching, um, and it has to be a really. It usually is going to be a pretty gradual change.
Correct. And normally at the end of an episode, you reset. So something, any growth that they had is reset. So then,
Right.
and the next episode, they haven't grown that. But over the course of 10 years, they most certainly do.
Yeah.
And so I think that's an example of. So Dwight was even less likable in the first episode, right? And so
Hmm.
uh, over the course of 10 years, he becomes more likable.
Yeah.
But he's grown
Yeah.
from the community that surrounds him.
Hmm.
All right.
I think when I'll end it with, I'll close that thing with this is that when I'm writing a story, I want my characters to change personally. But I don't think it's necessarily a requirement for a story, but I do think that it adds the more satisfaction to the reader or to the viewer if the characters change in some way, particularly the protagonist.
True. There you go.
There you have it.
We couldn't have done it
Without Rachel.
without Rachel, the neurologist.
I couldn't have done it without you, John Myers.
Aw.
Aw.